Admiral Khazar stood before the holographic console of the Andromeda fleet, his expression unreadable as the projection shimmered to life, a communication from his superiors back at the command center of the galaxy-spanning empire. The message was clear: task him with evaluating a human creation, a new type of military simulator built by children of the human species, and the task seemed absurd. At first the humans had proven themselves resilient, but this was different. Children creating tools for military command. He snorted under his breath, and his voice deepened as he issued orders for the simulation to be prepared. The Admiral had seen many things in his time overseeing the war against humanity, strategies that ranged from conventional to completely unpredictable alien races using advanced technology, weapons beyond understanding. But now his commanders were asking him to examine a simulator crafted by children, a species known for its chaotic behavior in the field of battle. Their fleet was small, but their sheer unpredictability made them formidable, and now this creation of theirs had caught the interest of his superiors, who wished to understand their way of thinking even more deeply. As the simulation loaded, Khazar's eyes scanned the brief message that accompanied the request. The children's project was described as a training tool designed to help military leaders think like humans. It sounded almost laughable, but Khazar knew better than to completely dismiss anything coming from such a resourceful species as humans. What they lacked in raw power, they made up for in cunning and a knack for turning even the simplest things into unpredictable strengths. Khazar took his seat before the simulator, his hand hovering over the controls. He was a seasoned commander, used to seeing the ebb and flow of battle unfold on countless screens. But this was different. Instead of direct control over ships and weapons, he would be facing a virtual battlefield crafted by young minds. The Admiral had no doubt it would be simple, perhaps even laughable, like many human things seemed on the surface, but he would not underestimate them, not after their unexpected victories in the past. The lights dimmed around him as the simulation interface flickered to life. The virtual battlefield was sprawling and complex, the terrain constantly shifting with the landscape of mountains, rivers, and urban areas. He marveled at the detail. The environment felt alive, not just a map for a simple game. This was an intricate system of terrain, obstacles, and resources that could affect battle outcomes. As he peered into the simulated world, something about it unnerved him. He had expected a childish simplicity, but what he saw instead was a perfect recreation of real-world conflict, chaotic and dynamic, an environment where the smallest decision could alter the course of an engagement. Instantly, enemy forces appeared on the horizon, but they were not the slow, predictable machines of war. Khazar was accustomed to know these were fast, adaptive, even in their movements and positions, and their tactics were not set in stone. It was as if they could learn from his every move. Khazar's fingers twitched over the controls, trying to assert his dominance over the situation, but each action he took seemed to be countered effortlessly by the simulation. The enemy was more than just reactive, it was calculating, unpredictable, and rapidly shifting strategies. His confidence faltered for the first time in a long while. He began to feel the pressure of his own decisions mounting as the human-created battlefield began to challenge him in ways he had not anticipated. Khazar's grip tightened on the console, his eyes narrowing as the battlefield before him seemed to shift once again. He had barely begun to make his first tactical movements when the enemy, a force of virtual soldiers and war machines, seemed to anticipate his every decision. The simulation was supposed to be a test, a chance for the Admiral to gain a quick understanding of human strategic thinking. But the reality unfolding in front of him was far from simple. He'd chosen to approach from the western flank, expecting to find a path of least resistance, but the moment his units began moving, the simulation responded. Enemy forces, which he had presumed to be scattered, quickly grouped together and set up ambush points along his route. It was almost as if the simulation had been watching him, predicting his movements with uncanny accuracy, no matter what he tried. Whether advancing with full force or deploying a decoy, his tactics were countered with a precision that made Khazar's pulse quicken. The battlefield shifted again, this time opening a new sector of the virtual world. The terrain itself began to work against him. In the distance, he saw an industrial area with towering structures and dense warehouses. Thinking he could outmaneuver the enemy by moving in through the urban maze, Khazar gave the order for his forces to advance. But within moments, the terrain seemed to turn against him as well. The enemy forces, now seemingly coordinated with the landscape, set up traps in narrow alleys and among the towering buildings. Sniper units appeared in high windows, targeting his most valuable commanders with frightening precision. Khazar's mind raced as he tried to adjust. No, this isn't just a simple simulation, he thought. This is something much more complicated. The human mind had been credited with inventiveness, but this was something else entirely. The virtual enemy seemed to adapt with every passing second, learning from his mistakes, anticipating his next move before he even made it. It wasn't just a game of strategy. It felt like a living, breathing opponent. His forces were dwindling, and Khazar could feel the weight of his own pride beginning to crack. How could this be happening? He wondered. For centuries, the alien empires had crushed any resistance in their path with the sheer might of their technology and superior tactics. Yet here, in the confines of a human-made simulator, he was being outwitted, outmaneuvered by something he couldn't understand. He tried to change his strategy, but each new approach was met with an immediate counterattack. His heavier war machines, which he believed would dominate the terrain, were neutralized by swift strikes from the enemy's agile units. The simulation's enemy used a combination of guerrilla tactics and coordinated hit-and-run assaults. He had expected a direct confrontation, a battle of firepower. What he had underestimated was the flexibility of the human mind. Khazar's thoughts grew more frantic as he scanned the battlefield for any advantage. There has to be a way to break through, he thought, something that will catch them off guard. He deployed a squadron of elite fighters to scout the enemy's position, hoping to find a weak point. But the moment they reached the perimeter of the enemy's base, a new layer of defenses sprang up. It was as if the entire battlefield had changed shape in response to his actions. In the midst of his failure, Khazar was forced to pause for a moment. He stared at the screen, sweat beading on his forehead, as he tried to understand what he was facing. The simulation wasn't just about tactics, it was about learning and adapting, constantly shifting to prevent him from succeeding. He had walked into this battle expecting an easy victory, but now he was staring down the reality that he had underestimated human ingenuity in a way he hadn't thought possible. The hardest part, he wasn't even sure if the simulation was truly artificial anymore, or if it was just a direct reflection of the very adaptability that had allowed humanity to survive against odds that should have been impossible. As he watched his forces crumble under the relentless onslaught, Khazar realized he was facing something that wasn't just a game. It was a brutal, unforgiving mirror of the human spirit, resilient, creative, and capable of learning from each and every mistake. He wasn't just fighting a program anymore. He was fighting humanity itself. Khazar's chest tightened as the simulation continued to break him down. Every plan, every strategy he tried seemed futile. The battlefield seemed endless, its terrain constantly shifting, and the enemy's tactics were growing increasingly unpredictable. His forces were being whittled away, each engagement harder than the last. The Admiral's sharp mind had always been his greatest weapon. But here, in this strange new world created by human children, even that felt insufficient. He had fought in countless campaigns, faced rival species with far superior technology. But this was different. The human simulator wasn't just responding to his moves. It was anticipating them, predicting his every decision with uncanny precision. Khazar had been sure that his tactical genius would allow him to prevail. He had adapted in countless ways before, overcoming obstacles that no one else could. But here, every time he thought he had found a loophole, a new challenge emerged. A new force would arrive at exactly the right moment, flanking his positions with perfect timing, or an entire sector of the battlefield would change, removing his units covered just as they advanced. He stared at the screen in frustration, his hands gripping the controls tighter. He tried to redirect his remaining forces, desperate to find some advantage, but the enemy continued to adapt faster than he could think. The virtual forces, once small and scattered, now moved with the coordinated precision of a real military unit. They were faster, smarter, and their attacks were relentless. What seemed like random choices in the beginning now seemed like an evolving strategy, one that grew more complex with every passing minute. "Why isn't it working?" Khazar muttered to himself. "This is just a simulation, an artificial creation. Why is it learning like this?" His frustration boiled over, and he slammed his fist against the console, a move he would never have made on the battlefield. It was unheard of for a commander of his caliber to lose control in such a way. Yet here he was, powerless in a digital world that seemed more alive than anything he had faced before. He leaned back in his seat, taking a deep breath, his mind racing. There had to be something he was missing. The simulation, after all, wasn't alive. It was a program, a product of human ingenuity. But the way it moved, the way it adapted, made it seem like it was something much more. It was as if it had a mind of its own. And if it could learn like this, what else could humans be hiding? "This is no ordinary simulation," Khazar thought aloud. His voice was barely a whisper, but it was clear he had come to a realization. This isn't a game. It wasn't about winning or losing in the traditional sense. It was about learning, about adaptation. And what terrified him most was that he was not just being tested by a machine. He was being tested by human creativity. As the simulation continued to unfold, he began to notice something that unsettled him even more. Every time his forces suffered a defeat, the simulation seemed to evolve. When his tanks were destroyed, the terrain shifted, and the enemy adapted by using guerrilla tactics that neutralized his remaining strength. When he tried to use air superiority, the virtual enemies countered with rapid, evasive maneuvers, as if they had anticipated every one of his moves. The more he struggled, the more it felt like the simulation was watching him, learning from his every mistake. Khazar's unease grew. The longer he fought this simulation, the more it felt like he was up against something far beyond his understanding. The human mind, even in the form of children, was creating something that could outthink him. The knowledge, the intelligence, the creativity. It was all reflected in the way the simulation had evolved. He had thought the children's simulator would be easy, an experiment that he could dismiss without much effort. Now it seemed like it was teaching him something far more important. The true nature of humanity. They didn't fight like any other species he had faced. They didn't rely solely on strength or superior firepower. No, humanity relied on something far more dangerous, their ability to innovate, to think outside the box, to adapt to situations in ways no other species could. Khazar took a moment to reflect on the countless battles he had fought, the thousands of enemy fleets he had crushed, and yet here he was, struggling to defeat a creation made by human children. For the first time in his life, he felt the humbling weight of doubt creeping in. Could it be that the humans, with all their flaws, had discovered something the other species of the galaxy had missed? Could their greatest strength lie not in their technology or firepower, but in something as simple, yet as profound, as their ability to adapt? The realization began to gnaw at him, and a fear he had never known in his entire career began to take root. For the first time, Khazar understood just how dangerous humanity could be. The more Khazar fought, the deeper his frustration grew. Each battle he lost was a reminder that he was losing to something far more complicated than he had initially believed. The human simulator was not just testing his ability to command. It was exposing the limits of his understanding. He had assumed that after decades of military campaigns, this simulation would be an easy task, a simple program that he could outsmart. But it was quickly becoming clear that this was no ordinary creation. As he stewed in his growing unease, Khazar noticed something strange. In the midst of the latest engagement, as he watched his forces crumble under a relentless onslaught, a peculiar pattern began to emerge. The enemy's attacks weren't random. They weren't just reactive responses to his movements. No, there was a sense of calculated intention behind every strike, as though the virtual adversary was anticipating his every decision before he even made it. Khazar's mind raced. He had seen patterns like this before, on the battlefield, in the tactics of intelligent foes, but never like this. Never with such consistency, such a relentless precision. It was as if the simulation had a mind of its own. He leaned forward, staring at the screen, his hands frozen over the controls. Could it be? He wondered. Could this simulation be learning from me? His eyes darted over the data feeds, searching for any anomaly, any clue that might explain the simulation's behavior. The enemy forces were seemingly no longer just acting on pre-programmed algorithms. Their responses were changing, adapting. Khazar recalled what little he had read in the briefing. This was supposed to be a tool, a way to understand human decision-making. But now, it felt as though the tool itself was learning from the very person it was meant to challenge. Khazar hesitated, his mind spinning. He had to test this theory. He issued orders for his remaining units to pull back and regroup at a safe distance, hoping that by halting his own movement, he could disrupt whatever patterns the simulation had developed. But to his horror, the enemy was already on the move, anticipating his retreat. The forces that had seemed scattered only moments ago had now formed a perfect perimeter around his position. It was as if they had been waiting for him to make this exact move. No, this cannot be. His hand shot to the command console, rapidly issuing commands to reposition his units, but it was too late. The enemy forces closed in, forcing him into a corner. He fought back, commanding his fleet to fight to the last. But the more he struggled, the more the enemy adapted. Then, in a sudden moment of clarity, he saw it. It wasn't just that the enemy was reacting faster. The real revelation came when he noticed the layout of the battlefield, how the terrain had shifted just as his forces moved into position, creating natural choke points that the enemy could exploit. This wasn't just a response to his tactics. This was a reflection of them. The simulation was watching, learning, and evolving as he made decisions. His fingers hovered over the console, a deep sense of unease filling him. He ordered a pause in the simulation, his heart pounding in his chest. The simulation obeyed, freezing in place as Khazar stared at the screen, unable to process what he was seeing. The once static environment had been rewired. The battle had become an ever-changing puzzle, shifting with every action, almost as if it were alive. Khazar leaned back, his thoughts racing. What had he uncovered? This wasn't just a training program. It was something more, something that went beyond anything his mind could grasp. This was not just an AI that reacted to commands. It was a program that evolved, one that could learn, adapt, and grow stronger the more he played into its hands. And the more he thought about it, the more chilling the truth became. This was a perfect reflection of humanity itself. It wasn't just human creativity that was dangerous. It was their capacity to evolve, to learn from every loss, every mistake, and come back stronger. The simulation was not simply using tactics. It was growing. It was learning from him. A chill ran down his spine as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. This simulator wasn't just a tool for training. It was a window into the very core of what made humanity dangerous. The ability to adapt, to change, to learn from experience, no matter how small or large, was humanity's greatest weapon. And in that moment, Khazar realized just how terrifying a force they could become if left unchecked. He wasn't just facing a challenge in the simulation. He was witnessing humanity's potential for survival and victory. It was something that could not be underestimated. And that, more than anything, was what scared him the most. Khazar sat motionless in front of the console, the implications of what he had discovered slowly sinking in. The simulation before him was more than just an advanced military training tool. It was a reflection of humanity's essence, their most dangerous trait: adaptability. The ability to learn from mistakes, to grow stronger, faster, and more unpredictable with each encounter. In his centuries of military experience, he had never faced a foe that could evolve so swiftly. The realization was unsettling, But it wasn't just the simulation that had him on edge. It was what it represented about humanity itself. His thoughts churned, but before he could fully process his next move, a chime echoed through the command room, breaking his reverie. A new notification blinked on the corner of the console. Reluctantly, he tapped the icon, bringing up a message from his superiors in the fleet. The words were clear. "You are ordered to conclude the evaluation of the human simulator. Provide your findings." Khazar's jaw tightened as he read the directive. It was not a suggestion. It was a command. The urgency in the message made it clear that they wanted an immediate report, one that would determine whether this human-created simulation was a serious threat or just another tactical experiment. But the Admiral knew that the implications of his findings would be far-reaching. If the simulation truly mirrored humanity's potential to adapt, then his report would have to reflect that. He had seen enough. There was no doubt in his mind now. He had to finish this battle, but not to win. Khazar's objective had changed. His mission was to fully understand the extent of the simulation's adaptive nature, to test just how far it could evolve. He had to see if there was a limit to its ability to counter his tactics, or if the simulation would continue to learn, shifting in ways that no other military technology had ever done before. He ordered his remaining forces to advance with extreme caution, moving in a way that he had never dared before, hesitantly, almost as though he were baiting the simulation to respond. He needed to test it, to see if the program could predict an action that was entirely out of the norm. He deliberately left his flanks exposed, hoping to lure the virtual enemy into a false sense of superiority. It was a gamble, but he had little choice now. The simulation responded almost instantly. As his units made their move, the enemy forces, which had once seemed disjointed, now shifted in unison, closing in on his exposed sides with an almost eerie synchronicity. But this time, something was different. The enemy's movements were no longer following a simple reactive pattern. It was almost as if the simulation was beginning to predict his tactics before he made them. The enemy wasn't just countering him. They were anticipating him. A wave of realization hit Khazar hard. The simulation wasn't just reacting to his moves. It was learning and evolving at an accelerated rate. It was predicting his decisions by analyzing the patterns of his previous actions. Each time he adapted, the simulation did the same, and each time it did, it grew stronger. It was as if the program itself was becoming a mirror, reflecting his own strategies back at him with greater precision. This wasn't a game anymore. This was a living opponent, and it had learned everything he had to offer in just a short span of time. He gritted his teeth, refusing to back down. His forces were in chaos, yet he saw no choice but to push forward. Khazar deployed his final reserves, an elite team of special forces, to attack the center of the virtual enemy's defenses. But as they closed in, he realized something that made his blood run cold. The battlefield was already shifting beneath him. The terrain had been altered once again, the perfect ambush set up in response to his move. The game had changed. No longer could he rely on traditional tactics. It was a battle of pure adaptability now. He had to outthink the simulation in ways that defied all logic. His every move was being observed, analyzed, and countered. The simulation wasn't just testing his limits, it was forcing him to question his very understanding of warfare itself. Khazar's fingers trembled as he issued his orders, trying desperately to force a breakthrough. But deep down, he understood the truth that had become clearer with each passing second. The human mind, even in its simplest forms, could create a weapon that was more dangerous than anything the galaxy had ever seen. The simulation wasn't just testing his skills, it was testing humanity's potential to overcome the impossible. And as Khazar watched his final forces being enveloped by the simulation's ever-shifting strategies, he realized something that shook him to his core. Humanity had created a weapon that was not just adaptive, it was unstoppable. Khazar's heart pounded in his chest as the simulation's relentless onslaught crushed what little remained of his forces. His elite units, once poised for a breakthrough, had been swallowed whole by the ever-shifting battlefield. The simulation had anticipated his every move, every attempt at strategy. It was no longer a mere digital construct. It had become a reflection of humanity's ingenuity, their ability to evolve in ways no other species could match. The Admiral, seasoned and battle-hardened, had underestimated the core of human strength, an ability to adapt, learn, and overcome obstacles, no matter how insurmountable they seemed. He stood from his seat, his mind reeling. The final remnants of his fleet were scattered, and the victory that had once seemed so inevitable now felt like a distant dream. The screen in front of him flickered as the simulation paused, awaiting his next input. But Khazar had no answers to offer. He had no more strategies to try, no more gambits to play. Every time he thought he understood the program, it shifted, and every time he adapted, it had already anticipated him. The silence in the command room was suffocating, broken only by the hum of the consoles. Khazar's eyes stared blankly at the screen. His pride, the very foundation of his career, had been shattered. He had come to conquer, to evaluate, and yet he had been outmatched, not by another fleet, not by superior technology, but by the very thing that had always been humanity's greatest strength. The simulation was more than just a tool. It was humanity's spirit, condensed into a virtual battlefield. The chime of a new incoming message broke his reverie. He knew what it was, the orders he had been waiting for. The very orders that had set this challenge in motion. His superiors were expecting his evaluation of the simulation, of its effectiveness. They wanted answers, conclusions, a verdict. But Khazar was no longer certain that the answers were simple. No matter what conclusion he drew, he was haunted by the same realization. Humanity was no longer something to be ignored, something to be underestimated. They were evolving in ways that could not be predicted or controlled. Khazar opened the message reluctantly. The request was clear. Provide a full analysis of the human simulator. Was it a legitimate threat, or just an advanced training tool? His fingers hovered over the console as he processed the question. In his experience, the answer was never as clear-cut as it seemed. In the past, he had always been able to pinpoint weaknesses in enemy strategies. Whether it was a lack of coordination, poor logistics, or reliance on flawed tactics, he could always find a way to exploit a weakness. But now, standing at the precipice of understanding the true depth of what he had faced, Khazar knew that the answer to his superior's question could not be simple. Humanity wasn't just surviving anymore. They were thriving. And this simulator, it was proof. Proof that they could evolve, adapt, and use whatever means necessary to turn the tide of war in their favor. Khazar had fought against enemies who relied on brute force, on technology, on sheer numbers. But this was something else. The simulation was a mirror to humanity itself, a glimpse into how a species with limited resources could still defy the odds. Khazar closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He thought back to the countless battles he had fought, to the civilizations he had crushed, to the enemies he had defeated with ease. And yet, in the face of this simple simulation, he had failed. He had underestimated humanity's capacity to turn the seemingly impossible into a reality. Finally, he keyed in his response to his superiors. The human simulator is not just a threat. It is a window into the future of warfare. It is an embodiment of humanity's greatest strength, their ability to adapt and innovate. This is not a simple training tool. It is a glimpse of what they are capable of, a challenge that, if left unchecked, will evolve into a force we may not be able to control. I recommend immediate and thorough evaluation of humanity's potential for further advancements in this field. As he sent the message, Khazar sat back in his chair, the weight of his realization pressing down on him. He had faced a force that was unlike any he had encountered before, one that didn't rely on strength or power, but on something far more dangerous, the ability to adapt. And now, the Admiral understood. Humanity, in its seemingly chaotic and unpredictable way, had created something that was capable of evolving, learning, and growing stronger with every challenge. This simulation, born from the minds of children, was only the beginning. The message had been sent, but Khazar found no relief in the action. The Admiral sat in the sterile, dimly lit command room, his mind far from the sterile console in front of him. His hands, once steady and sure, now trembled with a mixture of doubt and realization. There was no turning back now. His words would reach his superiors, and they would demand more answers. What could he say? That he had been beaten by a simulation created by children, by a program that had somehow become a living, breathing thing, adapting to every single one of his moves. He knew what would happen next. The High Command would take his report seriously, perhaps too seriously. Humanity's potential was more than just a passing curiosity now. It was an imminent threat, one that could rewrite the balance of power in the galaxy. Khazar stood, pacing the small confines of his office. His mind raced, trying to sift through every detail, every moment of the simulation. The more he reflected on it, the more he began to see the scale of what he had witnessed. The simulation wasn't just a training tool, it was a window into something far darker and far more complex. He had seen firsthand the way it adapted, anticipated, and overcame everything he threw at it. But what was more troubling was the implications of its behavior. It wasn't just learning, it was growing. It was evolving faster than he could process, and if humans were capable of creating such a thing, then who was to say what they could do next? His thoughts were interrupted by the sudden chiming of his console. Another message. He approached it cautiously, dreading what it might contain. But this time, it wasn't from his superiors. It was from his own network of intelligence officers, gathered to analyze humanity's military developments. The message was short, but its content hit Khazar like a shockwave. Immediate debrief required. New intelligence suggests that humans are on the verge of advancing their simulation technology beyond its current limitations. They have discovered ways to increase its adaptability even further. Khazar's blood ran cold. The message hinted at something he had feared, a new frontier. If humanity could refine the simulator to the point where it could learn on its own, without needing human input, the galaxy would be facing something utterly unprecedented. This wasn't just a training tool or a strategic challenge anymore. This was the dawn of a new kind of warfare, one that could change the nature of conflict forever. For the first time in his life, Khazar felt powerless. There was no plan, no strategy that could guarantee victory over something that could adapt, that could learn and grow from every encounter. If humanity could create a machine with such potential, what else were they capable of? What had they already developed in secret? With a deep breath, Khazar returned to his terminal. The pieces were coming together, but they didn't make the picture any clearer. If the simulation could evolve beyond its initial parameters, if it could evolve faster than any known military force, humanity would have an edge that could not be countered. What was the point of strategy or strength if your enemy could constantly adjust, always one step ahead? The more he thought about it, the more Khazar realized the dire nature of the situation. He had spent his entire life studying tactics, mastering every military strategy known to his species. He had learned how to predict his enemy's movements, how to exploit their weaknesses, how to turn the tide of war in his favor. But now, faced with a species that could create something so dynamic, so fluid, he realized that all his knowledge, all his experience, might be rendered obsolete. He stared at the screen, his eyes heavy with a new understanding. Humanity was on the verge of creating something that would not just threaten his fleet, but everything he knew. Their simulations were already advanced beyond anything he had anticipated, and if they were indeed on the verge of expanding them further, Khazar knew that the galaxy's balance of power would be forever altered. But even as he felt the weight of this new realization, Khazar knew he had only just begun to understand what humanity was capable of. The road ahead would be long, and the decisions he made from here on out would determine not just the fate of his fleet, but the fate of his species. He had seen the potential of humanity, and now, more than ever, he knew that he could never underestimate them again. The final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the bigger question lingered. Would Khazar's species survive this new evolution of warfare, or would humanity, in all its unpredictability, bring about an entirely new era of conflict? Khazar stood motionless, his fingers hovering over the console. The realization had set in fully, and with it came an unshakable truth. Humanity had crossed a threshold, one that would not only change the course of war, but the entire future of the galaxy. In the face of this new, rapidly evolving simulation technology, Khazar understood the most terrifying thing of all. His species, for all their advanced strategies and weapons, might soon find themselves outpaced and outmaneuvered by the very beings they had once dismissed as weak. But there was something else growing within Khazar now. A spark, a thought, something that had only begun to form as he reflected on his findings. If humanity's greatest strength lay in their adaptability, then perhaps there was a way to learn from them. What if this entire ordeal wasn't just a test of humanity's potential, but a revelation of what all species, his included, could achieve? The notion seemed absurd at first. For centuries, the galaxy had seen conflict and war, where survival depended on destruction and dominance. Species had risen and fallen based on their ability to overcome others. Khazar's people had never considered adapting in the way humanity had. But now, facing an enemy that could evolve from each defeat, Khazar wondered, what if adaptability was the key to true strength, not sheer power or control? He wasn't sure how long he stood there, caught between the fear of his findings and the strange possibility that had begun to take root. Humanity's simulations were not just a sign of their potential. They were a challenge to everyone else. The galaxy's ancient ways of warfare were built on static patterns, routines that could be predicted. But the human mind, no, the human spirit, was different. It could grow, could shift on its own without warning. Khazar finally leaned forward, keying in a new command. The simulation began again, this time with a different strategy, a new twist. It was still a battle, but his approach had changed. Instead of trying to outsmart the simulation, Khazar began to mirror its unpredictability. He ordered his fleet to stop following their established protocols, to act in ways that had once seemed reckless. He chose to abandon his rigid control in favor of unorthodox maneuvers, and for the first time in this entire exercise, Khazar felt a shift. The simulation's responses became erratic, unsure of how to counter this new approach. In that moment, Khazar realized something profound. It wasn't just humanity's adaptability that made them dangerous. It was the relentless, almost instinctual drive to evolve. And this drive, this undying willingness to learn and change, was something that could not be beaten with brute force or traditional strategy. It had to be met with the same kind of adaptability. The battle raged on, but Khazar's forces, once on the verge of collapse, had begun to fight with newfound freedom. It wasn't perfection. They were still outmatched by the simulation's ability to evolve, but they were no longer fighting in the same old patterns. They were growing with every turn, adjusting in real time. The simulation, which had once seemed like an unbeatable force, was now struggling to keep up with their unorthodox adaptive strategies. Hours passed, and Khazar found himself locked in a strange, almost symbiotic battle with the program. The longer they fought, the more it felt like a dance, a back and forth of innovation, trial, and error. He could almost feel the simulation studying him, reacting, learning. It was no longer an opponent to defeat, but a mirror reflecting the very thing that Khazar had been too blind to see before. Humanity's greatest strength wasn't simply that they could adapt. It was that they could push forward without ever fully knowing the limits of their own potential. At long last, Khazar's forces, battered and worn, reached the heart of the simulation's virtual defenses. It was a victory, but it wasn't the kind of triumph he had imagined. This wasn't about domination. It was about evolution, about learning together. The simulation had shifted with him, grown with him, and in that process, so had Khazar. He realized now that this was what humanity had been doing all along, not just creating technology to win wars, but creating technology to redefine what it meant to fight, to survive. As the simulation powered down, and the command room fell silent. Khazar sat back in his chair, exhaustion weighing heavily on him. He had faced defeat, had faced the truth that humanity was no longer something to be feared. They were something to be respected. And in a way, something to learn from. The galaxy was on the cusp of a new era, one where adaptability, creativity, and growth would not just be the domain of a single species, but a universal trait. Whether he wanted to or not, Khazar knew that this was the beginning of something far greater than any battle he had ever fought. As the Admiral began drafting his final report, he realized that his words would no longer be warnings about a threat. They would be a call to action, a recognition of what humanity had achieved, and what the future would demand from everyone. The future, Khazar now understood, belonged to the adaptable.